Here they give us a problem where they show student work. Here's the work right here. And they ask us in the step-by-step simplification of the expression below, what property is not used? So what's the expression? Well, since they're showing the student work here, right, it stands to reason that the very first thing you see is the expression that's being simplified. In this case, this expression right here, which says 3 times the sum of 1 plus x. So we're simplifying this expression. And how do we do that? Well, notice the first thing they do is they rewrite the expression. And what do they write? Well, I noticed that instead of writing 3 times 1 plus x, right, they write 3, and then they change the order of 1 and x. So they have x plus 1. So now these expressions are equivalent, and how do we know? Well, just because we've changed the order of x and 1, so that 1 comes second and x comes first, this doesn't change the answer because we're adding those two expressions. So there's a property, of course, that tells us that if you have any number, let me change colors there, if any number plus another number, and then you can keep going with this, right? Any order that you add these things in, you'll still get the same result. Or if you're multiplying, so if it's A times B times C and so forth, right? You can change this order and multiply a different way, and it won't matter because you'll still get the same result. What property is this? Well, when you're adding and multiplying, and that's the only operation you have that's affecting the expressions or terms you're looking at, well, that's the commutative property, right? That's this term right here. So this is an example of the commutative property right here. And if you have a hard time remembering that, what you can think of is a commuter going to work, right? Because the word commutative, right in there, is this word commute. So moving around, and that property tells us that moving around will not change the result. And that's what they're doing right here. So yes, they are using the commutative property. They use it right here. So I want to cross that out. And next, if you look at what they wrote, they're writing this. 3, oops, that's not a helpful color. 3 times x, they're using a dot for times, plus 3 times 1. Well, what did they do there? Well, they took the 3, right, and they multiplied it by both terms inside the parentheses. That's an example of the distributive property, right? You might have seen this, a times b plus or minus, right, c equals a times b plus or minus, depending on the operation, a times c. This property allows you to multiply, right, a term by other terms, right, as long as we're adding or subtracting in here. So you can multiply a by b and a by c and then add or subtract, or you could add a and b, add b and c, or subtract c from b and then multiply by a, right? So in any order you do this in, you'll still get the same result. That's the distributive property. In a simple case, you can just look at if I had like 3 times 2 plus 4, well, I could do 2 plus 4 and get 6, right? And 6 times 3 is 18. Or I could do 3 times 2, which is 6, and 3 times 4, which is 12, add up those two, and I still get 18. That's the distributive property, and we're using it right here. So we have used that. I'm going to cross it out. And now, what's this? Well, it says 3 times x plus 3. Okay, well, what are we doing there? Well, really, we're simplifying these two terms right here. So instead of 3 times x, right, we get 3x. So we're multiplying those two. And then 3 times 1, we get 3. And then we're going to add them. So what property is that? Well, let's look at these two properties that are left. We have the identity property and the associative property. Well, the associative property says if I have a plus b plus c, right, and I'm grouping a, b and c, that's the same thing as a plus b, right, plus c. In other words, I can actually add a and b first, or b and c, and then add it to a. Or add a and b and then add it to c, and I'll still get the same result. And this is true for multiplication. So a times b times c, I can multiply b and c first, or a and b first, right? and then multiplied by c. And that'll still equal the same thing. So that's the associative property. What does the identity property say? Well, it depends if we're talking about addition or multiplication. But for addition, the identity element is 0, right? So if you have anything plus 0, 0 doesn't change that number you started with. So the identity element for addition is 0. And then for multiplication, right, the identity element is 1, because anything times 1, right, is still the original number you started with. So what property do we use here? Well, it's not really the associative property, right, because we're not grouping things. Even though we're multiplying 3 by x and 3 by 1 and then adding, what other way would we group them, right? We're not rearranging things here. We're not regrouping. Instead, we're using the identity property. It's right here, right? 3 times 1 is 3. That's acknowledgement of the identity element 1 in multiplication, which we just mentioned down here. So we do use the identity property. So here, the only property we don't really use is the associative property right here. All right, so I hope that helped.